All right, we're going to get started. I'm Steve Hoberman, Director of Technics Publications. We publish books on data and also related topics, including the book we're going to learn more about today, Graham Witt's Technical Writing for Quality. Technical writing crosses all disciplines. And if you've read his book, and you'll learn more about it today, you can see how a lot of the pointers and techniques and tips that he offers you can use anytime you're doing writing. In fact, when I read the book, and I've read it more than once, I've picked up certain things that I use when I write, even some smaller things like how to format tables and what kind of font to use, like a sans serif font, which I actually just applied to a book very recently. So it came in handy right away. So a bit about these celebrations, these book release celebrations. There are two reasons for doing them. One reason is to celebrate, because writing a book is a monumental task, and it's wonderful to celebrate with the author with this accomplishment. Second reason is to get some key messages, kind of learn. I find it's very almost inspirational to me to hear what went into, what was the reason for writing the book, what are the key messages in the book, and being able to put all that together in a 15-20 minute talk. It's also wonderful just to meet the author. Graham Witt has been in the data and rules and IT in general space for over 40 years. He has a specialty for data modeling, a specialty for business rules. I've actually attended a large number of his sessions over the last number of years and always learned something. I still use and give him credit for his technique for using this time clock when he's looking to indicate history on my models. I still do that today. He's presented at many conferences, including our conferences, our data modeling zone conferences. He has written and co-authored 3 books, Data Modeling Essentials, which is one of my first books, actually, and how I came up to speed a lot on modeling, which he co-authored with Graham Simpson, Writing Effective Business Rules, and also Data Modeling for Quality, which we published a couple of years ago. Wonderful book on data modeling. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Graham. By the way, if you have any questions, put them right in the chat window and we'll answer them. So I'll turn it over to Graham. Graham, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mark and Terry, for attending, as well as Michelle. I can't see who else is attending, but thank you all for joining me. Now, what I'd like to do is start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I speak to you today. That's the Darug people, the First Nations people of Australia here, and pay respects to their elders past and present. Okay, a little bit about me. This is, if you like, my potted biography. And so I graduated in '69 and have been through the path of firstly being a programmer, then systems analyst, data administrator, data modeler, and rebadged, of course, as data architect later in the day. But in the '80s, I sort of took a second. I branched out into linguistics because I'd always had a fascination for linguistics. And in the meantime, as Steve has pointed out, I helped write and wrote some other books and produced a number of journal articles, also spoke at various conferences. Now, one of the reasons I've listed this is because I looked at this and I thought, now, so what did I actually produce during all that time? And of course, I produced lots of programs and systems and scripts and interfaces and models. But what I also produced is an awful lot of documents. As I was just saying to Steve before we got started, I worked for a client for about 3 years here in Sydney. That's the State Lands Authority. And they're responsible for cartography and for land, real estate transactions. And as part of a national initiative in Australia, they wanted to combine or somehow come up with a single way of dealing with land transactions across Australia. Each state has its own rules, and so there was a massive task in harmonizing the business rules. And there is now an electronic conveyancing system, which I'm really, really proud of, because I played, with all due modesty, I played a major part in its design. And well over 100 documents were produced in that time. We're talking long documents. So what sort of documents are we talking about? Well, in the early days, I was writing specifications, user manuals, and occasionally requests for tenders. Later on, participating in the writing of tenders, proposals, and business cases. More recently, product reviews and recommendations, and then got into the area of standards and glossaries, which has probably been my sort of forte for the last few years. And I have no idea how many thousands of words I've written, but there's quite a lot. So moving on, why I actually wrote this book is because I had been for a long time aware of a particular problem. So here we have a writer, and over here we have some readers. So the typical, maths is that, one person writes, or maybe two, and then a whole bunch of people read what is produced. So let's just imagine that this person is writing a specification for a system that's going to manage the public-facing map of the transit system in a particular city. This happens to be a little segment of the public transport map in Sydney. They have just, with all due reason, they've decided that the different coloured lines on the map should be called lines. And we call, in a lot of cities, you actually talk about the orange line and the green line, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, that all seems very reasonable. But of course, these people reading the document, they see the word line, and of course, they come from different backgrounds. And curiously, here is a reproduction of the actual track layout on the transit system, and the asset manager, he thinks, well, lines, we manage corridors, the corridors in which the tracks sit, and we call them the main west line and the main north line. So there's only two lines there, but not quite the same lines as the lines that the original person was thinking. But of course, the operations people, they think of the individual lines, the up main, the down main, the up suburban, down suburban, etc., etc. So all of a sudden, we've got three different meanings of the word line. And worse, what we have is that the readers have not only identified different meanings of the word line from what the writer proposed, but they differ among themselves. So let's just imagine these people all go away and produce data models or whatever they need to do. They have a table called line. I think we can see a problem emerging here. So the issue for me is quite simply, and if you like, this is the quality criterion for a document. The one quality criterion you need for any document is that every reader understands what is written and has the same understanding. And if you have documents which don't meet that criterion, either because they're unclear or they're ambiguous, you could very well end up with costly rework. And I've actually seen this in operation. That statement I hate to hear at a progress meeting in a system development is, I thought you meant, and I think, here we go. Okay, immediate rework, how much extra is this going to cost in terms of time and money? Okay, then, so let's do a cause analysis of this. There will be immediate causes and underlying causes. This is a standard, way of analyzing causes. So some of the immediate causes, obviously ambiguity, we've just mentioned that. And as Mark and Terry admirably pointed out during their book launch, there are all sorts of different types of ambiguity. Over long sentences. It's really curious that people often write sentences. I often wonder, is this because they're trying to impress, or they're not sure what they're saying? There's all sorts of possible psychologies behind this. But the overlong sentence takes much longer for a person to try and disentangle. And I've actually seen people, I've watched people when they're reading a document on paper or even on a screen, and you sort of watch them hover over the overlong sentence and then shake their head and move on. And so they don't even bother to try and understand what that sentence is saying. And of course, they may well have missed something in so doing. Then there's the poorly structured sentence, the sentence that, and I've seen this so often. One of the things that Word or any word processor allows us to do is move stuff around in a sentence. But you see these sentences where there's something tacked on the end. Oh, hang on, I forgot to mention so and so. And they tack it on the end when it really should be at the beginning or in the middle. Hello, that's what we've got word processors for. Then poor word choice. And I see this so often. Foreign words, the Latin or Greek phrase that even the writer may not understand, let alone the readers. Archaic words, notwithstanding, and all of those sorts of things that are beloved of the legal profession. Buzzwords, all those wonderful words that people like to use to show that they're with it. I know, breaking the envelope or something to do with envelopes. I can't remember what it is now. And then marketing language. The number of times I see the words exciting and game changing and all of these sorts of things. Well, that's fine in marketing, stuff, by all means, but not in a serious system specification, So beware the emotional adjectives. Then, of course, we have these specific types of words. Synonyms, we all know. Well, the only problem is with synonyms, if you use both, say, client and customer in the same document, are you meaning the same thing or are you meaning something that is slightly different? So synonyms are fine in poetry and literature, but in technical documentation, you pick a word and use just that word, because if you use some other word, people are going to wonder whether it is just a synonym or whether it's, as I say, something subtly different. Contronyms are a problem. Sanction, for example, we all know means to allow or to disallow. And consult is interesting because if I engage a consultant, I'm consulting with them, but they are consulting to me. And I found that the word consult it's not always clear who is the provider of information, who is the receiver of information. And then you get polysemes. This is a word I discovered during writing this book. A polyseme is a word that has multiple meanings. And argument is a classic case. The argument of a function, but then there's an argument which is a discussion, or an argument which is a dispute, or even, if you like, an argument which is a set of logical statements which support a certain proposition. So be careful when you're using words. And then there's a circuitous argument. The person who has basically done a brain dump of all the thoughts that they've had about something without actually taking the reader on a journey from the various possibilities to a final decision. And then, of course, ungrammatical sentences. Now, actually, ungrammatical sentences often don't occlude the meaning. It's fairly clear what the person meant to say. However, ungrammatical sentences have a nasty side effect in that they reduce the confidence that the reader has that this person really knows what they're talking about. So I'll leave that with you. Okay, so what are the underlying causes? And I would suggest there's actually three. Now, I don't know whether this is the case in America or the UK, but in Australia, I can say I have the evidence, having been a teacher. The teaching of English has, I don't know what's happened to it. I suspect it was, but I learned grammar when I was at school, but then when I taught, I didn't teach English, I taught maths, but when I taught, I discovered that grammar was no longer important, it was self-expression. And I don't think we've ever recovered. And I can cite multiple studies that show that it's really appalling. And I have worked with people who have degrees, but are technically illiterate. And then, of course, there's the media. The media no longer employ proofreaders. So the number of ungrammatical sentences you see in newspapers and magazines and on the strap lines on TV these days, it's worrying. And then, of course, the resources available to people. Dictionaries, of course, are descriptive, so they whatever, the idea of irregardless being a word, or don't worry about the distinction between lend and borrow, that's all very well, but that doesn't really help people trying to write precisely. And then, of course, there's this wealth of social media. There's this, I mean, Facebook, they basically say that a meme is not a meme unless it has a grammatical error in it. So people no longer have any sort of solid, uh, landscape of the language that they can rely on. Now, whether this is the case in other languages, I don't know, but English seems to be poorly served these days. Okay, so I just want to talk about just a few topics, and I'm going to brush over them, but these are some of the topics covered in the book. One way in which language varies is register. So you have formal language, standard, and informal. This is one way of defining the registers that are available in a language. So formal is the sort of language you would get in a constitution or a legal contract or so on and so forth. At the other end of the scale, you have informal language, such as used in social media. And then you have what is commonly referred to as standard register or standard English or standard whatever. And that's the sort of language that you expect to find in a technical document, and that is the language variant that this book promotes. Now, there's also geographical variation. Somebody once famously said, and I've no idea who it was, that the US and the UK are two countries divided by a common language. Actually, there's more similarities than differences, but the differences do exist. So when I started, writing down all the differences, I realized that there are differences in spelling, in phraseology. For example, Americans say 110, we would say 110. Dates, of course, we all know famously that the US and UK dates are represented differently. Punctuation, there's quite a variety of punctuation differences or differences in punctuation rules. Personal names are treated differently. And title case, interestingly, the case that you would use, which words do you capitalize? And that varies also between the US and the UK. And that's just a few samples. Canada, of course, is a problematic place because it seems to have what we say in Australia, a bob each way. In other words, sometimes it's the US standard, sometimes it's the UK standard. So I can't really help the Canadians. They'll have to work it out for themselves. But the rest of the Commonwealth and Ireland, you tend to adhere to the UK standard. But of course, there's actually another level of variation. Once we bring in all these different countries, there is another variation. That's in terms of vocabulary. So the words we use in our different English-speaking countries may vary. One classic example is that whereas a plot of land on which you can legitimately build a house because the land belongs to you, it's called a parcel in Australia, but it's called a section in New Zealand. So I'm sure that all the different varieties of English have their own personal words for, or their own specific words for different concepts. So let's just look at a few more topics. So one of the important things, of course, is to compose and form a document in a way that makes, that takes the reader on a journey. So the structure of the document, the way it's divided into chapters and sections and so on. Chapters may not apply in a technical document, but sections, certainly, sections and subsections. Drilling down the clarity of each individual sentence, and the narrative flow. The sentences in a paragraph, and to some extent the paragraphs in a section, should take the reader on a journey. You tend to start with what the reader already knows and then introduce new ideas to increase their awareness of what we're talking about. There is an alternative approach, and that is to start off by saying something outrageous that the reader didn't even know about and then explain why that's true. But that has to be done with care. And this could all be summed up in a movement called plain English. There's been a movement in both the UK and the US, and no doubt elsewhere, to make language plainer. And in fact, there's even legislation in the US to cover, I can't remember the exact title, it's written up in the book. There's a federal legislation which mandates the use of plain language in government documents. Document layout is actually quite important. I hadn't realized it was until I started reading some texts on the psychology of reading. The amount of white space, the arrangement of text on the page actually affects comprehensibility in quite markedly. Then there's the choice of wording. There's the organization's language, which we should use rather than the words we think are the right words to use. Technical terms. In technical terms, it's a two-edged sword. Technical terms may be well understood by some of the readers, but not by others. So we need strategies for dealing with those. And that can be technical terms in terms of the if you like, the technology that the organization is used to, such, for example, the rail transport has its own technical terms to deal with track and locomotives and so on and so forth, and signaling. But then, of course, there are the technical terms that come with the technology that we are suggesting the organization use, such as databases and applications and so on and so forth. Another area where I feel wording is important is facts, opinions, and assumptions. If we make a statement, are we saying this is true and there's not even any need to argue about it? Are we saying it's our opinion? Are we assuming something to be the case? And it's often the case I've found in documents that I've reviewed that it's not clear what is being stated here, a fact, opinion, or an assumption. Then, of course, there are the rules-based statements, such as obligations, capabilities, and prohibitions, and it's important to word those in ways that make clear what is going on. And then, of course, there are words and phrases to avoid, and all sorts of different reasons, which are listed and dealt with in the book. And then, of course, specific content is not just textual. Most documents will have certain things which, if you like, go outside the narrative series, list of things. And of course, there's all sorts of issues there with how we actually represent those. You know, the list of functions of something, or the list of capabilities, or lists of requirements, and so on. Definitions. How do we define things? Where do we define things? Quoted material, how we deal with quotations from other sources. The use of abbreviations. Numeric information. I started a little section on numeric information, and it grew because I just realized, you know, currency amounts, weights and measures, dates, and so on and so forth. There are so many rules about how they should be represented. Headings. They have their own rules and requirements. And then, of course, cross-references and citations. Okay, just a few more topics. Completeness of a sentence. Sometimes you will get these sort of full stops that occur in the middle of a sentence, and you think, hang on, that's not a complete sentence. And there's a whole lot of rules about what makes a complete sentence. Word order. Word order is an interesting thing. Sometimes you can change the order of words in a sentence and it does not change the meaning. Other times you change the word order and it no longer makes any sense at all. But then there are other sentences where moving a word to a different part of the sentence changes the meaning. That was a journey of discovery for me when I started analyzing this. Joining clauses. Okay, various ways in which you can join clauses. That by conjunctions is the common way, but there's all sorts of other issues involved in joining clauses. Agreement, classic agreement issue is subject and verb. If the subject is singular, the verb should also be singular. But there's various other forms of agreement. There are then some contentious rules, and these are rules that some people, will die on the hill of, such as not ending a sentence with a preposition or not splitting the infinitive. And of course, I have to say that the Oxford comma falls into the contentious rules area. It is a preference, and I respect the preference. And if it is a preference, then by all means follow it. However, it is not actually a rule. And it all depends what style guide you're using for a start. You know, interestingly, the Oxford style guide no longer mandates the Oxford comma. So there's some interesting stuff there. And of course, rules governing series. There's a whole bunch of rules there. Again, I hadn't realized what they were until I started to try and put them down. Rules about punctuation, which are really interesting, in particular, the differences between the US and UK approach to punctuation with quotation marks, whether the comma or full stop goes inside the quotation marks or outside. So I thought I really need to analyze this and put it down for the record. And the rules about capitalization. So there's all sorts of interesting things there. And finally, there's a section in the book of common errors, because I found that when you're telling people this is what you should do, it's also a good idea to have the other side of the coin. If you have done this, you want to think about it. And so I've just listed some of the common, and of course I've got a long history of reviewing other people's documents, and not knowing that I would eventually write this book, I used to record these in a little document of sentences I never would have written. So I had lots of things to work off, and of course, well, you can see them yourself. So, what's in it for the reader? So I would say that there are practical techniques. It's not just a theoretical book. There are practical techniques, because there are things you can look at and say, okay, this is what I need to do in this particular case. But the important thing, as always, is that the document be easily understood and accurately convey the message that you want to tell the reader. Practical advice on document organization and layout, and you can read the rest yourself. Rules and conventions. So I've listed the rules and conventions, but that's more for reference purposes. So that's down the end of the book, so you don't have to go there if you don't want to. And then all sorts of examples of mistakes that may be made, together with the corrected alternatives. It's all very well me saying, you know, this sentence has a problem. You know, okay, what should you have done instead? And so the key messages, and you can read that yourself. But I'll pick just a few to sort of spice it up. The important thing is to understand your readers. What do they already know? What do they need to know, having read your document? And once you've got the answers to those two questions, that should guide you in what you write and how you write it. Okay, structure, clarity, narrative flow, and be consistent. This is important. If you decide to use a certain word or a certain way of expressing something, it's a good idea to follow through with that and be consistent throughout the document. Again, word order and punctuation. And I think, as I said before, you know, grammatical correctness does not render a document automatically misunderstandable, but it lowers the tone, and it reduces confidence. Does this person know what they're talking about?